So this is the monthly meeting for the OpenChain community focused on North America and Asia. We had a meeting earlier this month for North America and Europe. In this meeting, we'll be doing a little bit of a catch-up on the previous meeting, and we will also be doing some further editing of the standards that we're currently reviewing. Before we get started, I'm going to show our antitrust policy notice. I'm going to leave that on the screen for a couple of minutes, and we will have some time also for new people to dial in. The full antitrust policy can be found on the Linux Foundation website, and if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can ask our counsel, Andy Updegrove, any questions you might have. The purpose of the antitrust notice is to make sure everyone is comfortable with our discussion. And of course, we show it at the beginning of every meeting. As I said, I will now leave it up for a couple of minutes. Okay, let's get started. So because we're doing some spec editing and we're going to be quite busy potentially with that, I'm going to have a shorter version of our agenda than usual. We're going to quickly go through some news for the project, and then we're going to go on to the editing portion. Now, for those of you who have been following our mailing list and our regular news blog, you'll know that a lot has been happening. Some of the key news at the end of last year was that companies began announcing support to help people use the new security assurance standard. The number of providers supporting it has continued to expand this year. We've also seen some interesting adoption announcements around the security standard. Notably, BlackBerry has announced that they are whole entity conformant with this standard. This means that BlackBerry is the first company in the world to be whole entity conformant with our ISO standard for license compliance and our de facto standard for security assurance. Now, that's very good news, of course, and the good news continues with our global coverage of third-party certifiers. We recently added TÜV in the Taiwan office to our certifiers. This is important because TÜV is providing certification into mission-critical industries like automotive. Now, of course, people can self-certify to our standard, and we recommend that as a great way to get started. But in some industries and some parts of the supply chain, it's very important to have third-party certification available. And we're very glad to welcome TÜV Nord for that reason. When it comes to our training courses, we've had some really good information regarding metrics. We have had good responses on the courses we've released. In fact, our courses are some of the highest ranking in the LF training system. Well done to the education team for building these courses. And well, and of course, we're delighted with everyone who's taken them and completed them. Some interesting news about companies using the courses. For example, Continental has made our LFC 193 course required for software developers since last year. And Bosch has been asking suppliers and requiring their internal staff and external staff to use it since the year before. Now, we have also been doing things like releasing webinars as usual, and one of the interesting webinars that you probably want to take a look at is around automation. Many people have said that they would love to have databases for automation. Many people have said they would love to have improved security automation. The vulnerable code technology and the VunTotal expansion to it provides a great way to do security analysis. Speaking of great ways to do analysis, our colleagues over at the SPDX project have been doing some great work too. They just held their first ever dev room at FOSDEM. FOSDEM is Europe's largest conference for open source. In fact, it might be the largest in the world. And we have had a good response, I understand, from that dev room held in the SPDX event. There were presentations from Fossology and SW360, which are, of course, open source tools for open source compliance, and then mission critical discussions like SPDX for safety. They're working on definitions for types of SBOMs. CISA will soon be publishing information about that, and there is a link to the white paper in these slides. I will be sending the slides around later. Okay, let's move into the main part of this meeting and talk about the standards and core material. When it comes to editing the standards, we have been doing some interesting work. I'll just recap what we did on the last meeting to help you understand where we are at today. So I'm going to, first of all, show 3 slides or 4 slides explaining what we were looking at in terms of the slides from the last meeting. And then I will quickly show you what we decided. So the first topic we discussed at the last meeting was to revisit the definitions of open source. It had been identified via our friends at CAICT that there was a mismatch between the security and the licensing standards. They identified that the definition included in the security standard referenced open source as the definition published by the Open Source Initiative or the definition published by the Free Software Foundation. However, the definition in the License Compliance Standard, our ISO standard, had the same plus or similar license. Our community discussed this over the last 2 or 3 calls and decided that we would align the security specification with the ISO standard. So we're going to change the language in the security specification to include the final 3 words or similar license. This is going into the draft 2nd generation security specification. This means that there is no change to the license compliance specification, but there is a change to the security specification. Just out of reference, and I will be bouncing back and forth to this in the meeting, here is the security specification 2.0 draft. And as you can see, we have changed the definition from saying that into saying this. So now it matches the ISO standard for license compliance. Okay, let me hop back to my slides and show you the next bit. Uh, we had a discussion about adding definitions for remediate and mitigate. So this is something that we opened a discussion on, and the rationale in full is included in our meeting. But in short, we agreed that it is something we want to do. We want to include some definitions. I'll come back to that in a moment. We discussed adding some information to the competence category of the security assurance standard. There was a suggestion sent in to add requirements. Now, this would have changed the scope of the standard. We discussed this and we decided not to expand the scope of the requirements with these requests. We felt that that might be providing too much of a burden and it might be a little bit too granular. We're trying to make a high-level standard. Finally, there was a suggestion to add references to existing ISO standards into our standard. This was a suggestion for the security assurance specification. We reviewed this and we decided not to. There were a couple of reasons, not least that the standards suggested are proprietary standards in that you have to pay for them. You can adopt them easily, but you have to pay for access to them. And we decided that we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to reference standards that you had to pay for. This doesn't mean you can't adopt them. Of course you can. And you may find it very useful to adopt them, but we will not be including them inside our standard. What is important is that there's no reason that you can't use our standard and the other standards. There is no conflict. All we decided was not to include a reference. Now, with each of these things I've mentioned, we have GitHub issues open. Okay, so there's links like this, and each link shows you specifically the conversation and the resolution. So if you want to know exactly what we discussed, if you want to know how we decided something, you can follow those links and do that at any time. I'm going to show you an example of this. Now, we're not going to go into detail of that. I'm just showing you an example of this for reference, and I'm just putting this in the chat right now. The example I'm showing you is the open source definitions. It shows a request coming in English and Chinese as it happens. It describes this, it links it into other areas, it has comments around it, and then eventually it has our conclusion, which is basically to make sure the license spec and the security spec say the same things. For each of the topics we discussed, it's exactly the same. There are GitHub issues open or closed that contain all the discussion we had. And this historical record allows you to understand how and why we made decisions. Now, coming back to the main part of our topic, I just went through what we did. We closed the open source definition issue. We have one action item open. We decided not to continue two suggestions, one of them to add stuff to the standard in terms of requirements, and the other to add other ISO standards to our standard. This means that on the outcome of the last call, we have one open action item. There's something that we have to do, and this call is where we can do it. I'm just going to pull that up right now. This item that we have to do is adding definitions for remediate and mitigate to the security assurance standard. Before we continue, I will just put one more link into the chat. This link is the full summary of our last meeting, and this will allow you to easily access all the issues I just mentioned and see the video of how we discuss things. But let's jump into the point of what we have to do now. We have to look at adding definitions for remediate and mitigate into the security standard. To help with this, I have opened the security standard on my computer. I'm just going to share that screen very quickly. And we have to look at adding the definitions for remediation and mitigation into this. These suggested definitions are on this screen. These are the ones that were suggested, and we have to decide if those definitions are suitable or not. Now, I noticed that one of our co-chairs for spec editing is on the call. Hi there, Chris. Obviously, I want to hand over to you to discuss the language. What I suggest is that I copy these two items and I put them into the security specification. I'm going to put them in here. I'll just put them under here. Okay, so the numbering is incorrect. That doesn't matter. I'll just change the numbering to an obvious placeholder. The key thing is to create definitions of remediate and mitigate. As far as I know, we do not have that. We do not have remediate or mitigate in the current definitions. So we're starting from scratch, and this was the proposed language. And I suggest that we work on that right now. And also, I just wanted to note that I had some feedback from people that they were a little confused about the difference between remediation and mitigation. So it sounds like making sure these definitions are clear will be super useful. Chris, I was wondering if you had any comments or notes on the definitions here.
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you perfectly.
All right. So remediation does occur when the vulnerability is eliminated or removed, as it said. And what that means is that you've identified where in the code the vulnerability stems from specifically, and that you can, and either the originator of the software or someone has identified how to go into the code and fix it, so there's an existing patch that's available that you can apply to eliminate that vulnerability from the piece of software. And if it hasn't been established yet, there's no agreed to fix that's out there, a patch as it were, then if you can identify where in the code you can go in order to fix the issue and rewrite it so that it's no longer a vulnerability, then you could say that the vulnerability has been eliminated or removed. A lot of times you have to be careful so that you don't actually break the code by trying to generate the patch yourself, because a patch really needs to be thoroughly tested in the software in order to make sure that all of the other functionality still works in the application or piece of software. Mitigation is different because it's all part of the same work that you do when you're doing the vulnerability assessment. And you're going through the vulnerability assessment and you find that there is no patch that's been established yet, and you don't think that you can safely remediate the problem by rewriting the code and doing all of the required testing to make sure that the functionality is still there. But you do realize that your application, the way that you are trying to use that piece of software, does not utilize the function within the open source code that you brought in your software application, then you could safely say that the risk is mediated based on the fact that your application does not use that functionality within the software code. Another way of mitigating risk is to determine what environment your software is operating in. Say, for example, you're operating in a closed Kubernetes environment in a container, and that you've got software precautions that are built around the software container that do not allow for anyone to invoke the vulnerability inside your code, which is working inside the Kubernetes orchestrated environment, then you could attempt to mitigate it that way. That's really, again, it's going to involve a lot of testing to make sure that there aren't any new pathways open to the vulnerability that you've created, and testing such as some kind of a light penetration test, just to make sure that nobody can come from outside of your environment that you're in and exploit that vulnerability. So that's what's called mitigation. Is it saying the vulnerability is still there, but because I'm using it in this fashion, or I'm using it in a isolated environment, such as a Kubernetes container, so I'm willing to accept the risk. The risk is now low, and therefore I'm going to consider that I've mitigated it by these things that I did. And that then it's up to the recipient of the software to determine whether or not they're going to accept your application with that vulnerability in it, because it's contained within the software, and it's not vulnerable for that reason. The biggest and easiest mitigation, of course, is always that you do not use that functionality in your big overall application, and therefore you can pretty confidently state that you've mitigated the risk. And there is, if you go down to section 3, where I've got that list in there. Let's see here.
I think 315 maybe.
In 315, we could add mitigation into this section rather easily, if you feel that you would like to do that.
That's a really good point.
And I could actually, because it is part of the software analysis that you need to do for any vulnerability that you've determined reaches the threshold where to you it needs to be remediated or mitigated. And that's especially severe threats, or threats that are above, say, a 7, and you say you're going to mitigate or remediate all of those. So it is an important step, and it does actually belong in a standard practice implementation. So I think we ought to at least mention it in there, because it wouldn't be hard to fit it into that paragraph right there, 315. If you like, I can work on that this week and put something in there as a discussion point for people to look at.
That would be fantastic. I think that, first of all, the description of remediation and mitigation is really useful. I noticed that some of the feedback we were getting in our call, but also offline, was that occasionally people confuse what's the difference between remediation and mitigation. And just based on what you were saying, I expanded our definitions of remediation, remediate and mitigate, and I think it's very clear now. Remediation is eliminated or removed. Mitigation is where the impact is decreased without eliminating the vulnerability.
Right.
Uh,
So
Yeah.
and it reduces the risk to an acceptable level.
And of course, this I think helps people frame that mitigation is probably uh, something you might choose, but ideally you should probably remediate and just get this fixed if possible, because mitigation always leaves a door open. And if something changes, like someone changed your Kubernetes setup, suddenly your mitigated problem might come back.
Correct. Yeah, there's
That's
always,
fantastic.
so remediation is the real goal of what you're doing. Sometimes it's not possible to remediate it, and in those cases, you've got to make a risk determination as to, are you willing to accept that risk?
Fantastic. Just pausing here for everyone on the call. Do you have any comments or questions about the language being proposed for remediate and mitigate? This is just draft language. We're not intending to say this is the right language. We're intending to say this is the start of making it clear.
I think it makes sense. This is SD. I think it makes sense. Because it, uh, the company choose remediation or mitigation is depending on the cost benefit analysis. So they can choose the best solution can fit their requirements. Aside from that, regarding the mitigation, um, maybe it's worth to mention the compensating countermeasure. Sometimes the organization or company adds some extra or external compensating countermeasure to mitigate the risks or the vulnerability.
Do you have a suggestion of how we might include that idea, SC?
Compensating countermeasure means it's employed in lieu of or in addition to inherent security capability to satisfy security requirement. It
Hmm.
could be the uh, dog or the door lock or the guard, the CCTV,
Hmm.
something external to the components or the source code to protect the um, component.
So in this way, what you're suggesting, this is an example, it's not intended to be accurate, but an example might be a firewall would prevent something accessing a security flaw, regardless of whether the software itself was changed. I guess this might.
Exactly. The IPS IDS could be an example to this case.
Mhm. I think this sentence is the one we have that covers that in concept, but we might need to improve this sentence. Isolating the vulnerability to prevent its exploitation. So the external system to isolate the vulnerability or prevent access. Mm, maybe isolating or preventing access to the vulnerability to prevent exploitation. To include things like firewalls or security guards. Does that make sense, or is it going in the wrong direction?
I think it makes sense to expand that a little bit in it, because preventing access to the environment where the vulnerability exists absolutely prevents exploitation. So I think that that would be acceptable. But I think if you start listing every single piece of the infrastructure that constitutes the environment that might help you, it's gonna get wordy. If you start listing firewalls and so
Right.
forth.
And the fear, if we get down to specifics, which is always our fear, is that we will accidentally limit the standard. make it so that it says you can do this, this, or this, but by absence prevents another option to be on the table.
Right.
Okay. So in general, then, isolating or preventing access allows people to interpret it as, oh, I'm using my firewall, or I've locked down my web server, or whatever they're up to. But it doesn't say you have to do any of those things.
Yeah, you could even preface that sentence by starting it with, for example, it could also involve things like isolating or preventing access to the vulnerability.
Okay. Okay. Maybe I can start here. I put it on the previous sentence. How about that? So now both of the described actions are effectively examples. Or okay. How about this? So both of the actions undertaken are now examples and therefore essentially optional, and it's your choice what you do to do this mitigation.
Right. And then it's up to the end user, the person who's receiving the software, to use it in their environment as a binary, and they're looking at the SBOM, they can see what you've done, and then it's up to them to make a decision as to whether or not they want to use that piece of software that has a vulnerability in it.
That looks solid to me. SC, does that cover your point?
Do think so. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. As a complete side note, firewalls have fascinated me, especially on things like routers, where we turn on the firewall and something magic is meant to happen, but we have no idea what it's doing. This is not for the spec, but just a side note. Okay, so we have remediation and mitigate. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to very carefully, very quickly check if we have remediate elsewhere. And we seem to have it in the document in one place under 332, security assurance. Okay, this is really close to Chris's point that 315, where he's describing the methods to use, uh, is missing something that we can usefully add, because much later, where we're talking about documenting, we ask people to document remediation steps. But under the methods, we never said have remediation or mitigation steps. So later in the spec, we're saying document what you did. But earlier in the spec, under the methods, the standard practice, we never actually said do this. So it seems we have a perfect opportunity to expand the standard practice to include remediation and mitigation. And that will fit with the documentation of security assurance later, where we ask people to include remediation or mitigation.
Yeah, and those are both critical steps in software assurance. If vulnerabilities are detected, if they're not, then they don't mean anything.
A very good point. My suggestion is, as a temporary thing, how about I take down here in the methods, it says method to verify that identified risks have been addressed. How about I alter that, at least temporarily, to just to say will have been remediated or mitigated before the release of supplied software.
Yes, that'd be good.
And this is just to make sure it's in place, so we can come back to the language later. And then my suggestion is I go down to where we wanted the documentation and where we talk about remediation steps being documented. We should probably say remediation or mitigation steps being documented. Does that make sense? Just to make sure that we cite mitigation as an option, because otherwise the only documented item is remediation here. I'll just highlight this so people can read it.
Yeah, and that section there is where we would actually put some, just a couple of words about if it's determined that there's no patch and
Right.
the vulnerability can't be remediated, then it would be acceptable to mitigate it if you can.
That's a great point, because we're looking here at the security assurance itself. So it's yeah. So this basically means that assuming our definitions are okay, we might say the definitions are done, but 315, the methods, and 332, the actual security assurance, need further review. Currently, it has placeholder language about remediation and mitigation, but we might need to make sure that the language here is structured correctly and it's as tight as possible, but as comprehensive as possible. Okay, I'm going to pause here and just give our audience a chance to jump in with any comments or questions. Especially, I want to flag that if you're mainly familiar with compliance, you might be thinking, I'm not so familiar with this discussion. Just remember, it's perfectly okay not to be familiar. It's perfectly okay to ask questions that might be basic or seem basic about this. The point is that anyone in the world should be able to download this standard and understand it. If you can't understand something, that's a bug. That means we're missing an explanation or our sentence is not clear. So our challenge here is to make it as clear as possible, so you don't have to be a security person to read this and think, okay, I understand what's going on. All right. If there's no questions, what I suggest then is that we wrap up here, that I prepare a summary of what we've done. Actually, what I need to do, I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay. What I need to do would be to say, we talked about remediation and mitigation, and we came up with these definitions. I'll just put these definitions in here. Apologies, it just takes me a moment to scroll. Okay. What I would say is that we came up with the new definitions. I put them in here, and I say that these are our draft definitions, and this issue will be closed at the next meeting unless there's a comment. And then I would open 2 new issues, so 2 new individual items. And the 2 new issues would be saying we need to review the standard practice implementation to make sure the remediation or mitigation language is okay. And then I open another issue and say that we need to review the security assurance section and make sure that the remediation and mitigation section is okay. And that means on the next call for North America and Europe, people would have those 2 tasks to review the language and make sure the logic is okay. If they think the logic is okay, then we close those issues and we have covered remediation and mitigation. Does that make sense to you, Chris? Is that okay as our next step?
Yes. Somebody had initially, and in looking at this, I read their comment and I thought, well, that kind of makes sense. They'd made a comment about getting customer agreement at or above a predetermined level, say security scores are above 4.5. If you're writing an open source application, who would you, and you were the originator of it, so it's going to reside in, say, GitHub repository, how would you go get customer agreement to do that? So what it might say is to, well, do you remember that question?
I do. And essentially, we're looking at the situation where the customer has to agree that the software is okay, even when there's an issue, and they look at the beginning point at the project, and the customer's saying, I mean, if I don't agree, who actually is responsible here? So, yeah. Mm,
Maybe just something about uh, obtaining end user or customer approval if possible, instead of just making it get customer agreement, which is more of just a plain
right.
old requirement.
How about, because it seems to be a different concept. I mean, we're talking about document and score things and document remediation or mitigation, but then we talk about execution. Maybe
Right.
this belongs in another bullet point.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to move that to another bullet point. Get customer agreement that the solution applied is acceptable to them.
Yeah, that the proposed resolution is acceptable. If you're remediating it, of course, it's going to be acceptable. I think it's really the mitigation step where you really need to ask, if you're delivering this as a product to someone, you really need to ask them if this is an acceptable mitigation for them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
And it helps with the logic because the last time that sentence was trying to do two completely different things.
yes, it was. And that's what's bothering me. And I would use the word obtain rather than get. It's more of a request to them,
Right.
because get's pretty final.
That's true. That that's true. And maybe this item needs to go one sentence down
Yes,
because, yeah, because we have the determination depending on the review score, contact the customer, upgrade the software component, no further action.
right,
So that seems to be your internal thought process, and then you go to the customer to obtain their agreement
right,
if necessary. Maybe if necessary, because if there's an issue and you remediate it, you might just say, well, why do I need to talk to the customer? I've already totally fixed this. It's not their problem.
right.
That seems to fix the logic, make it a lot more logical there. That's really good. What I'll do, because we've done something new, is I will take what we've just done, I will open a new issue on GitHub, fill out what we did and why, and then I will actually close that issue as well, just to say, we did this, it's complete. If you don't like what we did, reopen it, but we fixed something here.
Right.
Does anyone have a comment on that, or is everything okay with you? All right. Chris, that was a good catch. I think that improved the security assurance piece quite well. All right, everyone. We've done quite a bit here. So my suggestion is that we wrap it up here so that we can throw it over to the next call and give Europe a chance to review what we did. Just to make sure we don't overwhelm people, because we've done 4 things here in this call. And we want to make sure that we don't overwhelm people, that they can essentially look at everything we've done and comment on it. Would that be acceptable to you, Chris?
Yes, that'd be fine.
All right. So unless anyone has an objection, which you can do, you can stop us and say, come back, wait. Unless anyone has an objection, we pause here to ask, is there any other business today? If there's no other business, we will move to the close of the meeting. On the next meeting in 2 weeks, North America and Europe, we'll probably have both Chris and Helio. On that meeting, I'm going to practice a new initiative for me, which is I will try to shut up more and leave it entirely in the hands of Chris and Helio to run through the editing process and lead that conversation. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. Please have a beautiful evening or morning or whatever time zone you're in. Make it good. I will talk to you soon. And thanks again, Chris, for your guidance and leadership on this matter. It was super useful.
You're welcome.
See you all next time. Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.